بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be speaking here today. It's a great honor for me to speak in front of my teachers and my very dear friends here. We have a lot to get through as well, but I will try to go as quickly as I can. I've changed the title slightly just to represent what I'll be speaking about. I'm comparing two Ottoman traditions, one which is I'm calling Egyptian Syrian and one which I'm calling Rumelian Anatolian between these centuries. And the summary of what I want to convey is basically in these 4 points. First of all, the early classical Hanafi school, meaning the Hanafi tradition that produced the major teaching texts before this period, which was primarily in Central Asia, they had a very distinctive, very clear identity and approach with dealing with the question of hadiths. And it was very different from what we would normally consider to be hadith criticism. That's the first point. The second point is that this school, which I'm calling Egyptian Syrian, they pursued a very particular project to them, which was to bring this Hanafi doctrine in line with the non-Hanafi usul and the non-Hanafi hadith tradition. The third point is that what I'm calling the Anatolian Rumelian tradition, they resisted this project. Resist is quite a strong word perhaps, but we'll see that they were fully aware of what was going on, fully cognizant of it, and they chose not to have anything to do with it, as we'll see from some of the examples. And the fourth point is a small point, and that's why I'm going to be starting with it, is that both schools did make some changes in their usul al-fiqh on the question of hadith narration, but not in their practice with dealing with hadiths in fiqh. And I must start by pointing out the limitations of this study. It's not sufficient to study just a handful of books and then talk about these very great trends, an Egyptian school and a Turkish school, or an Anatolian school. And so I'll have to say my conclusions are speculative, but the data is clearly very interesting, and it does call for further study. The text I'll be looking at today for what I'm calling the Egyptian Syrian school, and I'll just be calling it Egyptian because that's where the bulk of the activity was taking place, are the books that are on the slide right now. I've put two figures in bold. One is Ibn al-Humam, who's from the Mamluk era, because he is the sheikh of this madrasa. He is the reason why this whole tradition took place. He's the one who started this idea of incorporating the wider hadith tradition into Hanafi fiqh. And so the whole Egyptian tradition is responding to him. The other figure in bold is this figure called Ibrahim al-Halabi. And he's just fascinating because I've put him with the Egyptians even though he lived in Istanbul and had a very prominent role in Istanbul as the khatib of the Muhammad Khan Masjid and the teacher of the Dar al-Qurra, which was established by Sa'di Chalabi, and he died here. But he's clearly Egyptian in his orientation. He studied in Halab, he studied in Egypt before his move to Istanbul. And his writing here is clearly, without a doubt, aligned to this particular tradition. So he's an interesting figure in his geographical movements, although intellectually he's very clear which school he belongs to in my presentation. The books I'm referring to for what I'm calling this Anatolian school are the books which are on the slide right now. All of them would be known to you. Al-Khadimi is the only person from the 12th century. All the texts are just 9th to 11th century. Bali Zadeh was less well known to me. He has a commentary on Kenzu Daqa'iq. He's originally from Bosnia, but he taught in Istanbul, and for 6 months he was the Shaykh al-Islam as well. So the first point I want to look at is this: what was the approach to hadith in what I'm calling the early classical school, the school whose main production was between the 5th and 7th centuries. This itself needs a big presentation and a debate and a discussion that we don't obviously have time for here. I just want to point out some small pointers which I think will indicate their very distinctive approach to this topic. Primarily, my own work has been on Usul al-Sarakhsi and the Hidayah of Marghinani, but using these as representative texts of this entire tradition, what I'm calling the Central Asian Hanafi early classical tradition. And there's two things that are very clear in that tradition. Number one, in their commentary works, they fill them with hadiths. They have a great interest in hadiths, to prove the fiqh through hadiths, but they never ever reference them to any known hadith book. That's one feature. The other feature that they have is, in their usul al-fiqh literature, they have a very particular method which you can call fiqh-based. The fiqh is the main arbiter of what makes a hadith strong or weak in their theory. And the theory is vast, but I just want to give you 3 pointers of where it's a fiqh-based approach, consciously distinct from the common Ahlul Hadith approach. 3 things that are normally studied in hadith studies: chains, narrators, and criticism, or jarh. When it comes to chains, they all state that that a break in the chain in the first 3 generations has no effect whatsoever on the strength of this hadith. The mursal of the first 3 generations, any break. And they also suggest after the first 3 generations, there's just a debate. That's how they present it. If you're with Karhi, then anyone's irsal can be good if the person is a recognized figure. And with on the other position is of Ibn Aban, which is a bit more cautious on accepting later irsal. So the point is, there's no commitment to connected chains. There's no concept of a hadith sahih in the entirety of this usul tradition. Hadith sahih as we normally think of it, connected chains with reliable narrators. When it comes to narrators, they also have an interesting breakdown. And the examples for this are only from the Sahaba. Again, in the normal hadith tradition, or what we normally study, the Sahaba are normally not questioned, the debate is after them. And in the Hanafi discussion on narrators, the amthila are just from Sahaba. And they're breaking them down based on 2 ideas. Are they known for riwayah or not? If not, then we don't know their status. If they are known for riwayah, then were they also known for fiqh, i.e. real great standing in fiqh? And they give the example of the early khulafa. If that's the case, then follow their hadiths no matter what. That's what all these early hadith texts state. If they're not known for fiqh, and they give always the example, which is seen as controversial perhaps, of Abu Hurairah. He's a well-known narrator, but he wasn't of the same standing in fiqh. They'll say Aisha rejected his hadiths, radiyallahu anha, Ibrahim al-Nakhai rejected his hadiths, and so on. So they're saying the Salaf didn't treat him as one of the fuqaha, so we'll follow his hadiths as long as some kind of qiyas supports it, otherwise not. And those who are not known for riwayah at all, we go to the fuqaha of the Salaf to see did they follow them or not. So again, the discussion of narrators, they've brought fiqh into the entire conversation, not simply what you'd call dabt, of what makes a narrator strong. And the last thing is a discussion they have on jarh. Again, primarily the usul I'm referring to is Sarakhsi and Bazdawi, but that was the main teaching text that came out of this tradition. The way they define the jarh of the rawi, if it's coming from the Ahlul Hadith, they clearly define it in a way to minimize that whole conversation. They don't want to open that door really. So they say, if the jarh comes from the Ahlul Hadith, we're not going to accept it in any rawi unless it's qualified. So if they say huwa matruk, huwa da'if, huwa dajjal, it means nothing. Give us a reason. And the reason has to be muttafaq alayhi. If it's he used to do fiqh, or he used to eat on the street, or he used to run after animals, it means nothing. And if this scholar has any sense of ta'assub, we're not going to listen to him. He has to be nasih. And as you know, many of them had ta'assub against Abu Hanifa. So you can see the way they framed it is, we don't really have to go there in that conversation, this jarh of the Ahlul Hadith, unless it really passes all these tests. That's just a quick pointer to their usul, that they're laying it out in a fiqh-based and not based on what you'd call the common idea of ilm al-hadith. Going back to their fiqh works, they are full with hadiths. They care about hadiths, and very often the wordings are not found in the well-known hadith collections. So why mention these hadiths at all? It's clear that they have an absolute conviction that Abu Hanifa's legal cases, his furu' represent sunnah, the sunnah of those who came before him. And this is where it might sound strange, but the hadith is strong because it accords with Abu Hanifa's furu', because Abu Hanifa's furu' accord with the sunnah. That might sound circular, and we can discuss that, but that seems to be why they don't need to reference any hadith in any of their debates. And the question arises, were they ignorant? Did they not have these books? And the answer is categorically not. They had a great interest in ilm al-hadith. If you gather like Marghinani's career from Ibn Abil Wafa al-Qurashi's book. Sorry, I have a stutter on some letters. If you gather his whole career from that book, he cared about hadiths a lot. He had the sama' of all of Tirmidhi, had an ijazah in Tirmidhi. He traveled to Maru to study Bukhari from one of the leading narrators of his age. He had the narrations in some of Sahih Muslim. He would gather isnads from many, many teachers in Zuhad. They cared about ijazahs, they cared about books, they cared about riwayah. But it never was of interest that these are the hadiths of fiqh. The hadiths of fiqh are the hadiths of the fuqaha, the hadiths that are transmitted in their books. And this suits their usul. These are the wordings of the people of fiqh, these are the transmissions of our sunnah, and that's how they separated it. It wasn't from jahl, that they had no interest in hadiths. It was a clear conviction of how hadiths and fiqh are meant to relate. Now, when looking in the usul of this Ottoman period, sorry, just one second. When looking in the usul of what I'm calling this Ottoman period, the texts I put on the board, Mullah Khusro completely follows this early tradition in every single detail that I've mentioned. He doesn't change any of it. The others all change it. There are small changes they add to the theory of hadith in the usul, in these pointers. One of them is they all incline towards, including Ibn Kamal Pasha, and Khadimi says, Qila innahu al-haq, so he also wants to strengthen it, that we don't need to differentiate based on fiqh. Dabt and adala is enough. And it appears that what they really wanted to do was not enter the debate amongst the Sahaba and say, no, if there's dabt and there's adala, don't differentiate between the narrators. That's one change all these later usul writers had. Another change, which interestingly is also in these Anatolian writers, is they watered down the anti-jarh conversation. They explained it, but then they said, well, actually, if the jarih is an alim, dabit, then we have to assume that he's doing it properly. And so the entire jarh literature then becomes open in the way they theorize it in the usul. So just a quick pointer, in the usul al-fiqh, in the Egyptian and Anatolian schools, there is a shift in the theory. A shift that does allow the jarh to be taken from these books, and a shift in not worrying so much about the fiqh of the narrator, but just his dabt. Again, the tradition of the wider hadith studies. They still, all of them accepted the inqita' and the irsal for the first two generations. No one changed that doctrine. But no one introduced this change in the usul into the fiqh before Ibn al-Humam. And so Ibn al-Humam starts this project of reimagining how to support the furu' of Abu Hanifa within this wider understanding now, the wider science of Ilm al-Hadith, the well-known science of Ilm al-Hadith and its books. And the Anatolians did not join him in this, despite the small changes they made in their usul literature. I've just got two small areas to show you. One is just a section on Sunan al-Wudu. It's a small section. It's not deeply rational. It's normally just a few hadiths. You know, you say the tasmiyah, you use the miswak. It's a hadith-based, non-rational topic. So just a nice, quick way to see, well, how are they using their hadiths? And again, the patterns are very distinctive and very clear. So if I start with the Egyptian tradition, just a few pointers. I can't obviously show all of it. Ibrahim al-Halabi, this interesting figure who's lived and died and taught in Istanbul, but he's purely Egyptian in his orientation. His commentary is full of these very interesting hadith points. So the tasmiyah is sunnah. He quotes the hadith, he quotes the book, which is something you don't even find that much in the earlier Hanafi tradition. He tells the chain has inqita', but he says that's okay in our usul. So it's again a Hanafi engagement. He quotes a version of this hadith in Ibn Majah, but there's a narrator that some say is majhul. Sorry, there's a few typos here actually. But who does he quote to lift this jahala? Abu Zur'a, Bazzar, Ibn Ammar. Again, the wider jarh tradition as the authorities. He quotes Ahmad to say this is the best hadith on the topic. He quotes another hadith on the topic. He says, oh, it's weak because this gentleman Yahya is matruk. Again, in the early tradition that means nothing. It's mubham. But in the later tradition, you can quote this. Now, this discussion is purely from Ibn al-Humam. It's not his hadith work. But what's interesting is Ibn al-Humam uses this discussion to say that tasmiyah is wajib in wudu. And he ignores that. So the later tradition is not following Ibn al-Humam. It's interacting with his project. It's sifting through his work within this new frame. And so what they mention and what they miss, all of it is worthy of study. Ibn Nujaym, on the same topic, he has a long debate with Ibn al-Humam why the tasmiyah can't be wajib. And in the debate, again, uses hadiths in an interesting way. Says there's the hadith of the Arabi who was not, the Prophet ﷺ taught this man wudu without talking about tasmiyah. So this indicates that this is not wajib. And he quotes Ahmad to state that, I can't read that. Khamsa, sorry. That there's no strong hadiths on this topic. Again, Shurun Bilali uses similar hadiths, Tumurtashi uses none. The takhleel of the beard, just a few examples just of how they're using the hadiths. Again, he quotes a hadith from Uthman radiallahu anhu, who quotes the books, the narrators. He uses the hadiths to support the riwayah of Abu Yusuf. Ibn Nujaym has an interesting thing in this hadith. The hadith says, كَذَلِكَ أَمَرَنِي رَبِّي. And Ibn Nujaym holds on to this wording and he says, oh, because it's amr, we don't need muwadhaba or practice to show the sunniyah of passing the fingers through the beard. The point being, there's a new kind of debate that they're all doing, or they're not following him, Ibn al-Humam, in his fiqh. If you look at the Anatolian commentaries, just in how they're using the hadiths, Mullah Khusru has not a single hadith in the chapter of the Sunan. He does in his book. I'm not saying he has no hadiths in his book, but it's interesting that even the Central Asians had more hadiths than him. Ibn Kamal has almost no hadiths. Bali Zadeh has a few, Shaykhi Zadeh has more, but look what's interesting. Shaykhi Zadeh has Fathul Qadir. He's quoting Ibn al-Humam in his commentary, but he ignores him in the hadith criticism completely. So when he goes to Takhleel, he ignores all the nice hadiths they had, and he goes back to the hadith of Sahibul Hidayah, that Jibreel a.s. ordered the Prophet ﷺ to do the Takhleel, despite the fact that the Ibn al-Humam says this is ma'lul because of a narrator. When it comes to the hadith of the siwak, he goes back to the wording of the Sahibul Hidayah, ignoring Ibn al-Humam's question that there is no practice of the miswak in wudu. He uses the wording, the Prophet ﷺ saying, I would order my nation to do miswak with the wudu, despite the fact that the whole Egyptian school said this is the weaker wording of the hadith. The stronger wording is with the salat. This is another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ doing wudu once, then twice, then 3 times. Ibn al-Humam says this hadith doesn't exist together. It's 2 separate hadiths, one strong and one weak. He ignored all of that. And he still quoted the hadiths as they came in the earlier tradition. So what we're seeing is Shaykhi Zadeh is someone who has Fathul Qadir in front of him. He quotes Ibn al-Humam about 30 times in the Kitab of Tahara and Salat. But he quotes him for his fiqh and never quotes him for his hadith work, except just one example that I found. And he ignores the entire Naqt tradition, and he prefers to use the wordings that are not found in hadith books, that are ma'lul, that are muda'af, that have matruk narrators, because it's the riwayah of the fuqaha. So this shows a conscious practice from the part of the Anatolian writers, a conscious choice in which hadith tradition they choose to belong to. I have 3 cases here. They're not so important. They're just another case, very small, of where the Egyptian school changed their fatwa based on Ibn al-Humam's debates. 3 very small points in prayer. And the point in each of them is the Egyptians followed Ibn al-Humam and the Anatolians did not. And they stuck to very rational, aqli, fiqhi arguments. And they ignored the entire hadith debate that the Egyptian school down to the late Ottoman period in Egypt was changing in accordance with. So the simple conclusions here is we can say that this Egyptian school, Egyptian Syrian school, was deeply influenced by Ibn al-Humam's project. They were all responding to him in their own way. And even those which were not going into detail, like Shurun Bulali doesn't go into many of these details. Tumurtashi even less so. If they were to quote a hadith, they'll still quote the best wording. The wording that this school said is the best wording. They're still influenced by wording, by narration, by referencing, and often the positions as well of the school. But they're not following Ibn al-Humam blindly, if you like. And so they invent this idea that if the hadith points to something and the school has a narration from Abu Hanifa, then you should follow the hadith, like a halfway house between hadith and the fiqh transmission. Whereas the Anatolian scholars were not influenced by Ibn al-Humam's project, despite that they were deeply surrounded by it. So they're quoting Fathul Qadir. Ibrahim al-Halabi is teaching in Istanbul. He's doing takhrij of ulama. His tradition doesn't seem to have footing, this aspect of his tradition. Bali Zadeh, this Bosnian Ottoman scholar who his career was in Istanbul, he's quoting Ibn Nujaym, he's quoting Ibn Amir Hajj, again the main student of Ibn al-Humam, and he's not affected by any of them in this point of the relation between hadith and fiqh. And so we can see this is a conscious move on the part of these scholars. It's not ignorance, it's not that they have no access, it's a conscious epistemological choice of what is the Hanafi tradition, and they've chosen to continue the early classical way. It's usul, it's furu', and it's wording, and it's mutun of what the sunnah is. This is a limited study of a limited set of texts. I think the patterns are quite clear, but there must be much more work to establish the natures of these school traditions. For the Egyptian tradition, we need to find out exactly how they're reconciling what actually are really two contradictory methods, if you were to really think about how they're arguing. And also, how are they really working with hadith? So in my case study, Halabi was the only one who brought new hadiths, not from Ibn al-Humam and not from Zayla'i. He brought new hadiths to support the school, the others did not. So what other sources are they using? How are they really working with hadiths after Ibn al-Humam? That's a question. And for the Anatolians, if they're not supporting the fiqh through hadiths, they're clearly relying on the classical rational way. Are they developing these rational ways in particular ways? Are they getting more philosophical? So this is the harder study. The hadith study is easy. The harder study is getting all of their ta'lilat and thinking very carefully how are they using them. But this is needed to better grasp the Anatolian fiqhi tradition. And thank you all very, very much for your time. Sorry for speaking a bit fast. Assalamu alaikum.